are talking street trash, or at least the 2024 sequel, remake, reimagining, directed and co-written by Ryan Kruger. Now this is a South African movie filmed and set there, and the original street trash movie was an 80s cult classic. I only reviewed it around a year or so ago, and you know, it's a strange movie, that's to be sure, and this one is kind of strange as well. And I think for the most part, the general consensus is that people prefer the original. Now, do I share their opinion? We'll discuss. Now, this really is actually a sequel rather than a kind of remake, but you can kind of watch it as a standalone movie. There is a line of dialogue in it that does relate it to the 80s movie. The story is that there is a kind of dystopian future where the kind of the homeless situation in South Africa has got to epic proportions, and there really is like a huge divide now between the haves and the have-nots. And there's a real kind of war going on essentially for power, particularly with batteries. And the mayor of this South African city has decided he is going to take action, and he has found the Viper alcohol that was in the first movie and has repurposed it as a biochemical weapon. And he wants to use this to wipe out the homeless and rid the kind of the upper class populace of this, unsightly menace, as they might see it. We focus on a group of homeless people as they scavenge for food and batteries and things, and there's a kind of like a female, a kind of new member to this kind of group, and that's our kind of group of protagonists, and we follow these as they discover this plot and try to fight against it. So let us discuss what works in this movie. So you don't have to see the original, but I would say, it does inform this one, because it is really a sequel more than a remake, because the actual story is quite different. This movie actually reminds me a lot more of the kind of like the 80s kind of Italian dystopian future movies, the kind of somewhat post-apocalyptic futuristic movies that you kind of got with these fighting these kind of cityscapes. The 80s were kind of full of them coming out of Italy, so it has that aesthetic to it, much more than the kind of the original movie. This one has a lot more plot in it, and it also has a lot more overt humour in it. Now that's not necessarily always a good thing, I would suggest, but it is trying to be a lot more funny on purpose, I would say, maybe than the original one, which was odd and quirky, but maybe a little bit more organically, shall we say. Some of the humour in this modern version actually reminds me along the lines of like Scott Pilgrim versus the World. It kind of almost is that sort of weird, over-the-top humour. But I think the influences here isn't just a kind of a remake of the original. It seems to me that they've taken the works of like the early Peter Jackson movies along with a bunch of other ones and kind of had that sort of popping head, gross out sort of style of practical effects that was popularised with the likes of Peter Jackson, Sam Raimi and the like. So let's just kind of refine that. So for me, what I liked about this movie, maybe over the original, is it has a more coherent story. It is quite different. The original movie was more, it didn't have really a particularly strong narrative, but I think that was, it was trying to get that transient sort of person perspective where it's just trying to survive rather than having A to B narrative, whilst this one, the modern version, is actually a more narrative story to it. There is, there's a class war, far more so here than the original movie. In actual fact, the last act of this movie is a full-on action movie, which really you only had a small amount of that kind of stuff in the original movie. There is a lot more of the kind of melting effect in this movie. There's a lot more victims, I would say, here on display than the original movie. And there's also lots of kind of like I say, action sequences involving kind of shootouts and stuff like that. So the movie is more action heavy. There's more set pieces. There's more scale involved. I should say the last third is really the homeless population fighting against this kind of like military style police in a full extended kind of battle sequence. So, so there is that, that's where it kind of reminds me of those sort of 80s dystopian future style movies that we kind of got, especially from Italy. I think the cast of characters is quite memorable, I would suggest. I think they all have their own little quirks. Like one guy, for example, he's got this like imaginary friend that is a little goblin creature, and we kind of see that. We see what he's seeing. So it has this kind of like this oddness to it. We've got one guy who we only ever see through like a POV. He never speaks. So we only see like what he's seeing like in a kind of first person view. So there's all these kind of little bizarre little quirks that this movie has in regards to trying to have a more of a stylistic choice compared to maybe the original. It does look like this probably has a little bit more of a production value than obviously the original, and all the effects are done sort of practically, and it's very gooey. It's very kind of gross. There's lots of kind of heads popping and pustules kind of expanding and stuff like that, and it's kind of like fun gross. It's not like realistic gore. If you're not a fan of explicit gore, but you like lots of kind of the sillier kind of stuff, this is more along the lines of that. In fact, most of the, if you haven't seen the original, most of the kind of the explosions are quite colourful in regards to kind of yellows and blues and stuff. So it's not, it's gross, but it's kind of, it's less gross than you may think in a way, because it obviously is going for a kind of comedic approach here. Some of the jokes I did find kind of quite amusing. There's a lot of kind of like just banter between our sort of characters, some of which I think works, some of which I think doesn't. Obviously humour is that sort of subjective art form that, some are going to like and some aren't, but I do think it works sometimes. There are certain characters who I wasn't so keen on, but there are ones that I do think actually were quite memorable with in a large degree. And I think the themes here of the 1% versus the 99%, or are a lot more apparent in this movie. This is a lot more clear about the kind of the message that it's trying to kind of have and stuff like that. Maybe what doesn't work, I mean, I just feel that kind of maybe the originality of the first one is a little lost in this remake, the sequel, because it ends up being a little bit more of a typical kind of science fiction action film in some ways, albeit ones with kind of like, some twists and some odd choices and some quirks and stuff, deliberately so. But the original movie, I think, was in a way so unique in its kind of, not just its visuals, but sort of storytelling as well. And although I would say you certainly have more people in melting scenes and with more frequency, the kind of the scene that everyone remembers in the original is the guy who kind of melts on the sort of the toilet and kind of turns into like a blob. And there isn't anything quite as extravagant as that, I would say. But because we have more of these things happening, maybe it loses some of its kind of effect. So you could argue that. And I think that would be fair. We see it a lot more often, so it becomes a little less kind of effective in a way. And onto the humour, I think that the other thing I would say is the tone of this movie drastically shifts 2/3 of the way through. because for the first 2/3 it is weird and deliberately kind of like off the wall, and maybe it's even trying a little bit too hard to be quirky, but then it kind of goes into more of a serious action movie in the last third, sorry. And although there's still a couple of elements of that sort of comedicness, it feels more, let's say like an action science fiction movie more than a comedic weird movie that the kind of the original movie that it's kind of started from. So that tonal shift, I think, could have been a little bit more, well, not quite so abrupt really, because it does feel a little abrupt. And then when you look at this kind of the differences in tone, you do feel that there's some kind of elements here that was superfluous, because it does want to tell a bit more of a straight narrative. You feel maybe was the MO, that was the kind of the way that this movie wanted to do. Maybe it could have been a little bit more constructed in that first 2 acts, because I feel there is a little bit of meandering in that first 2 acts. Now the first movie, as I say, was largely had a few kind of plot strands, but there wasn't as a clear a narrative here. But I think in a way that was kind of the movie that it was trying to be, whilst this one is trying to be more of a, you know, a linear narrative. And, you know, it could have been a little better used, a bit better paced maybe. But that being said, I have to say I probably prefer this one to the original. And then that's probably going to be controversial, and I suspect most people will prefer the original, but to me, just the stronger narrative thread here, and I think the clearer delineation between the message of what it's trying to suggest here in regard to this kind of class war, I think comes across more in this movie. And I think because it's kind of set as a science fiction film, you know, this is in the future with holographic displays and stuff like that, you know, it makes, you can kind of imagine it better set in a kind of a futuristic kind of society. And, you know, obviously with the kind of certainly with the growing homeless crisis, particularly in America, you know, it's not hard to see a future where we see something along the lines of this. So, you know, for me, I prefer this one, even though I wouldn't say it was a classic. And I do understand it maybe feels a little bit less original than the first. I still prefer it. So I'm going to give this one a 6 out of 10. Have you seen it? What did you think? Please do leave me a comment, and I shall look forward to seeing you next time.